But welcome everyone. This is the first conversation in our Captured Land series for 2024, and it's called Fire Island, Planning a Housing Crisis. And for those of you who don't know, this acronym FIRE, it stands for Financial Services, Insurance, and Real Estate. So we're going to get started with introducing our keynote speaker, move into their presentation. We're going to have a panel discussion followed by audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, concerns, ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to try our best to get to all of them at the end. So since the 1950s, Jamaica, which is where I am right now, has struggled to provide housing for the descendants of enslaved people who are leaving rural plantations for the city in droves. With population growth and increasing rural to urban migration, the rate of housing supply has never been able to meet the need for housing for purchase or rental. With 70% of the housing need being for lower income populations, policies to increase the housing supply have not made a dent in addressing this most critical of human needs. The result has been generations of self-built housing and self-built communities, with an estimated 20% of the Jamaican population living with this insecure tenure. Captured land is a phrase that rose to prominence in the 1970s following a wave of organized land occupations that took place with the implicit support of the state. So Captured Land's webinar series examines the legacy of our approach to providing affordable and decent housing since independence to the present and its outcomes. My name is Doreen Duncan. I'm the Executive Director of Island City Lab. We are a Kingston-based urban think tank that is dedicated to understanding the unique features and challenges of small island cities in the Caribbean. Our aim is to improve our built environment by building, fostering, and convening a network of civic thinkers to confront these challenges. This forum is part of that programming. So more broadly, the housing crisis across many Caribbean cities and indeed globally is often reduced to a simple matter of supply and demand economics. But it is actually a political process, with the government often marshaling investment, boosting land values, attracting desired residents and desired industries, simultaneously chasing away threats to profit. In this webinar, we're talking to Professor Raúl Santiago-Bartolomei about the rise of short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and Vrbo in Puerto Rico, and how investment and real estate policies are making housing unattainable for its residents. And of course, as he talks about Puerto Rico, I think we can all find relevance for our islands. So just quick bio Raúl. Raúl is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Planning at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. His research lies in the intersection between political economy, urban and regional development, neighborhood change, housing, and infrastructure planning. His current work focuses on assessing the long-term neighborhood change from disasters, particularly changing trends in residential segregation, urban decay, gentrification, and displacement, and migration after Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Raúl.
Thank you very much, Doreen, Jordan, and everyone at Island City Lab for this very generous invitation, for putting this event together, an attempt to find parallels between our dear islands throughout the Caribbean. Hopefully this conversation can lead us to assess and find mutual knowledge that we can share, see how we can improve our outcomes in each one of our places. So what I'm gonna cover today, as Doreen already mentions, to highlight the current housing situation in Puerto Rico, how it's rooted in the dynamics in the financial industry, but also cover a little bit of what were the key decisions that led to this series of outcomes that we're facing today. So I think I can start with the presentation. Let me see if I can.
Are you seeing the screen, Raúl?
No.
Jordan is sharing the screen.
Yes. Yes, okay. Yes, I see it. Yes, we're good. My bad. So perhaps we can go to the very first slide. Okay. So I'm gonna first provide a little bit of context and background, just to give provide a sense and convey a sense of the actual landscape of Puerto Rico and what are its actual underpinnings. Talk about the process of mid-century landscape transformation, how there was a crisis in manufacturing afterwards and why Puerto Rico is a manufacturing economy, how that opened the gates for housing financialization, and that's a term that we will define in the presentation. The second version of the housing financialization that has taken place, particularly in the post-disaster context. And of course, to highlight how communities are responding to this situation, because of course, communities are not passive actors and they are trying to find solutions to address the different grievances that are affecting their own neighborhood. So they just to for the sake of getting everyone in the same page. So Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. It's important to highlight that. It's been next slide, please. It's been a U.S. colony since 1898 during the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. took possession of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, which were the last remaining colonies of Spain. Puerto Ricans were made U.S. citizens in 1917, so that had consequences in terms of how policy is applied in Puerto Rico. So just a quick recap. So the United States federal laws and policy apply to Puerto Rico. U.S.-wide federal programs usually include Puerto Rico. So I'm just highlighting this, though it doesn't seem too unfamiliar when I'm referring to certain U.S. federal agencies when I'm discussing housing policy in Puerto Rico, is because it affects Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is included in those, in many of those programs. Next slide, please. So for a while, Puerto Rico was primarily a sugar economy, which is a generous way of saying it was really a sugar plantation for large sugar U.S. companies, right? And that lasted for around 40 years up until 1941, when there was as part of a series of New Deal programs from the during World War II and post-World War II policies from the states started being implemented in Puerto Rico. And one of those was an industrialization program known as Operation Bootstrap, right? Which was looking to transition from sugar economy to manufacturing. And the way it worked, there were a series of very generous federal tax exemptions for U.S. manufacturing firms to relocate to Puerto Rico, to relocate their factories in the island. And at first it was mostly textiles, textile manufacturing. So eventually it started transitioning towards petrochemical industries. But of course, this required new industrialized labor, right? And it also meant that there was a lot of divestment from rural areas and from agriculture. So as a result, there was a lot of rural to urban migration. Next slide, please. So as a lot of the industrialization manufacturing was taking place in urban places or adjacent urban areas throughout Puerto Rico. It made folks that were looking for new jobs that couldn't find them in rural areas to move nearby those places. But the government of Puerto Rico could never provide sufficient housing. So a lot of folks built makeshift homes in what in other places might be called shanty towns, right? Quote unquote informal settlements, self-built communities. And they started to proliferate in Puerto Rico, especially in urban areas, right? So here's an example of one famous one known as El Fanguito in San Juan. Now, after 1949, next slide, please. There was a series of landscape transformations that were taking place. When the US started implementing the slum clearance program led by the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, and in parallel, the US started providing very generous mortgage subsidies and mortgage insurance from the Federal Housing Administration. A lot of those programs were rolled out to Puerto Rico as well, but their implementation in Puerto Rico was somewhat very different. While the slum clearance program or the urban renewal program was mostly targeted to the inner cities of the large cities in the East Coast of the US, also New York, Philadelphia, Boston, all the way to Chicago. Started to relocate folks living in what was named subpar housing, and they were relocated to these public housing projects, right? The majority of these residents were African American, Hispanic migrants, were already living in those places as a way to provide what they conceived to be more dignified housing. In Puerto Rico, the implementation of this was mostly targeted towards the aforementioned informal settlements, the self-built communities. They started forcefully relocating folks from many of those places under the pretenses that they were insecure places, there were health concerns, and decided to relocate into these new public housing units. And just a quick stat: Puerto Rico has the third largest number of public housing units in all of the U.S., just behind New York and Chicago, and has the second largest public housing project, which is in all of the U.S., which is located in San Juan, called Luis Llorens Torres. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, there were also subsidized mortgages and insurance, which were essential to develop single-family housing. And then Puerto Rico started to have their very own first suburban communities, a manifestation of urban sprawl, where folks could be homeowners. And this slide shows a cover page for a manual from the Corporación de Renovación Urbana de Vivienda, the Housing and Urban Renewal Corporation, which is the main Puerto Rico agency in charge of housing and urban renewal, as the number suggests. They were in charge of implementing the slum clearance program. Showcases what would be the dominating policy framing up until this day in Puerto Rico. So under your lower, it's kind of like a stepwise approach towards social mobility and therefore housing quality and ownership, right? So at the lower left, you have what they call the arrabal, right? The informal settlements, folks living in the makeshift homes that had no formal tenure recognized by their government, no land title. The idea was they were be forcefully relocated. So that means that those communities would have a very, they would be largely criminalized by the government till this day because of that reason. They will be forcefully relocated to public housing, but public housing, when it says albergue transitorio, that means temporary shelter. Of course, even though it's policy-wise supposed to be temporary shelters, eventually became permanent communities, because a lot of folks, Puerto Rico's economy couldn't provide sufficient economic opportunities for everyone to achieve the social mobility necessary to reach the last step, which is the home ownership of a single family dwelling, right? So that's kind of the approach that Puerto Rico took for a lot of those years, and was pretty much the overarching view of how to address the housing issue in Puerto Rico. Of course, as I mentioned, we still have quote unquote informal settlements that are largely criminalized by the government. You have still the permanent communities in the temporary shelters of public housing that also tend to be very criminalized by the government. And folks that are homeowners in single family housing that, of course, have a more privileged status in terms of the rights that they might claim. Now, part of the fuel to do all this was the revenue and the earnings from all that manufacturing that I mentioned earlier. Now, starting in 1971, next slide, please. Oh, so here you have a picture of the Luis Llorens Torres public housing project in San Juan, which I mentioned, which is the second largest public housing development in all of the U.S. Next, please. And that's Puerto Nuevo, which was actually the second suburban development in San Juan, which was this very matchbox shaped single family homes that were designed for folks to eventually expand themselves and build upon them. But it was essential to mobilize the new home ownership class in Puerto Rico. This was done by not only by the subsidies on insurance or mortgages from the federal government, but also very generous subsidies from Puerto Rico's own government, particularly by providing public land to private developers to start building in many of these communities. Next slide, please. So things changed in 1971. And there were a series of events that led to that. First one being the federal government was on the way to remove those tax exemptions to the manufacturing firm. There was the 1973 oil embargo that was taking place as Puerto Rico was transitioning towards from textiles to petrochemical industries in the manufacturing sector. There was that led to a housing crisis, and eventually the new tax exemptions that were approved in 1976. So we go to one by one. Next slide, please. So yeah, the 1973 oil embargo, which was a worldwide phenomenon, made gas very expensive everywhere, was barely any oil to process and refine. At that time, Puerto Rico bet big on oil refinery as the next step in their manufacturing strategy. And betting big they did when they developed, this is one key site, La Corco, the Commonwealth Oil Refining Company, which was abandoned, built and abandoned. And it's a toxic site in the southern part of the island. And it's still there, a sort of a remnant of an era that barely ever took off. But that, made Puerto Rico face economic recession for the first time in many years. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. Stay in the other one. Sorry. Can you go to the previous one, please? Thank you. So that recession then made a housing crisis much more palpable in Puerto Rico and manifested in different ways. Not only was getting to be a homeowner a much more expensive endeavor now, but also a lot of folks couldn't find affordable rents. Much more folks started in that decade starting to opt to what they call rescue lands, rescate de terreno. So they built additional makeshift homes, right, in the quote unquote different additional informal settlements throughout the island, that were heavily criminalized by the government at that time. But also there were very innovative solutions to try to address that. That's when we started to see the proliferation of housing co-ops in Puerto Rico, housing cooperatives. What put an end to that was the approval of a new set of tax exemptions for manufacturing firms in 1976. So then we can go to the next slide. And that's what really started the process of the financialization of the economy of Puerto Rico, and the financialization of housing. Even though these measures were geared towards jumpstart the manufacturing sector in Puerto Rico. So next slide, please. So to discuss, so what is financialization? So financialization, as this definition from Manuel Albers might suggest, is the process of economic transformation where finance, insurance, and real estate sectors overtake traditional trade and productive industries in their share of total economic output. In other words, the fire industries that Doreen mentioned during the introduction of this conference started to have a larger share of the total economy, while more productive sectors like trade, manufacturing, etc., tend to have a lower share of total economic output. Now, how this takes place in different places, it varies. It doesn't necessarily respond to the same set of policies everywhere, but financialization is kind of a worldwide phenomenon right now, and it's been for a while, for many, many decades already. So, but to expand, to establish this, it requires new instruments for to establish new frontiers of financial speculation in ways that you can exchange in international financial market. So next slide, please. So what were some of the key instruments that were are commonly used to financialize an economy? So you have pensions, private pensions and public pensions. Those were securitized and used as investment tools in international financial markets. You have public and private bonds that used to be in their own unique set of local markets, now being securitized and exchanged and speculated on in international financial markets as well. And a key one to our theme here is housing mortgages, right? So when you have folks started getting mortgages from banks, those mortgages were grouped and packaged in a process called securitization that reached it's called secondary markets, where they're exchanged in international financial markets, and folks that might have a mortgage in San Juan were paying a debt to a bank. That bank then sold that mortgage to some other player in some other part of the world, and that was a way to get a relatively easy money that could be used for further speculation. Next slide, please. So in this case, and touching on housing, that meant that commodifying housing as an international financial tool has a direct relationship with housing development and urban expansion. In other words, we started building housing in ways that could be used to then resell a lot of that a lot of those mortgages in international market. Next slide. So the tax exemptions that I was mentioning for manufacturing, there's Section 936 of the U.S. Federal Internal Revenue Code, was used to jumpstart manufacturing, and it did, but it also jumpstarted finance as a percent of total GNP in Puerto Rico. You can see it in that graph. Next slide, please. And then, of course, that had consequences of how that provided. So as part of the requirements for those tax exemptions, the manufacturing firms have to deposit their earnings in local banks. So local banks now have a lot of leverage, a lot of money, a lot of deposits that they could use to lend for the development for new mortgages and new development projects. And they did. And in this map, you can see the expansion of the San Juan metropolitan area as measured by commuting, the work commutes that are measured from the US Census. In other words, as where the largest share of the workforce there tends to commute to San Juan, those adjacent municipalities become part of the San Juan metropolitan area. And it's a measure of how the urban sprawl through suburbanization was taking place in San Juan. Next slide, please. But of course, I mean, this only lasted until the tax exemptions were taken away in 2006. So here you see the number of commercial investment banks that Puerto Rico had at in some point 16 of those banks. When those tax exemptions started being phased out, they were dropping off all the way to, well, we have today only 3 banks. So there was a total financial collapse that actually preceded the world financial crisis. So we had a financial crisis before the rest of the planet, given the elimination of these tax exemptions by the US federal government. Next slide, please. And here you see the construction of the housing units. At some point, we built between, Puerto Rico was building between 10,000 to 20,000 housing units per year between 1992 all the way to 2006. And that dropped sharply once the tax exemptions were taken away. The manufacturing firms took away their deposits from the local banks. A lot of the banks started to shut down. And that meant that a lot of developers had to default on loans. So very little housing started to be built and reach a low point in 2018 of around 1,000 housing units per year. And we've been in that plateau ever since. Next slide, please. So here you see the number of mortgage loans that were originated. The bar chart shows the originated mortgage loans. The line shows the conventional loans. So the conventional loans are those loans that were not guaranteed by the federal government, which are usually the most attractive. So conventional loans are the ones that are much more speculative. And you can see that there was a sharp increase of those loans between 1995 all the way to 2006. And then they dropped sharply as a total share of loans. Next slide. Now, what's happening since then? Okay, so as a way to revitalize a lot of the financial sector, sorry, the Puerto Rico government approved Act 22, what eventually became Act 60, which is very generous tax exemptions for individual investors that wouldn't have to pay income tax nor capital gains tax if they move to Puerto Rico, as a way to foster additional investment in the island. There was a lot of easy money for investors at that time, given that the US federal government had very low interest rates as part of their policies they implemented after the world financial crisis. Another key aspect that characterizes the financialization of this current new wave of housing financialization in Puerto Rico is the presence of digital platforms like Airbnb. So what these platforms have done is that in Puerto Rico, we don't have very strong rental markets like, say, large cities in the US. There's the contrast between those that are homeowners and renters is very sharp in terms of their income. And that means that folks don't have a lot of disposable income after they have rent. So what a lot of investors, foreign and local, started doing is that once they have access to Airbnb and many of these other digital platforms, they could expand the scope of the pool of possible renters to a worldwide scale of tourists, right? That could pay a lot more than locals can for long-term rent. And what really, you know, provided the fertile ground for all of this was the disaster that resulted from the impacts of Hurricane Irma and Maria, when home prices plummeted, record lows. That meant that there was new fertile ground for many of these tax-exempt investors, corporate investors, and local investors to start, getting more and more into real estate and using the digital platforms as a gateway towards accessing new revenue streams or new ways to expand their portfolio of investments at this time. Next slide. So as I mentioned, I had Hurricane Irma and Maria, and I have to highlight that, of course, these storms didn't cause this, because the storms don't buy properties, they don't evict folks, they don't renting Airbnb, it's just rain and wind. But the decisions for reconstruction or emergency management that take place afterwards determine the possibilities of how to speculate on properties immediately after. Next slide, please. So here, you can see the housing price index in Puerto Rico between 1995 and 2021, as determined by the Federal Housing Finance Agency. You can see that there was an upward trend during the financialization period that I mentioned. It started dropping immediately after 2006 to its lowest point in 2018. And now, sorry, the sharp increase after 2018 it's unprecedented. The housing prices have never increased this fast in this short of time. Between 2018 and 2023, the housing price index increased by more than 28%, which is a huge increase. Next slide, please. So here you can see that it's not distributed equally, right? So those places that are in red or orange or light orange are those places that are that have increasing housing prices, different sectors in Puerto Rico. You see a lot of in the coastal areas, but you see also a lot in the inside of the island. Next slide, please. And these here are rental prices. So you see there are places that are getting much more expensive in coastal areas, certain parts of the center of the island when it's more mountainous, but very much near San Juan as well. Plus the island municipality of Vieques, which is the one under the second largest island in the right. Next slide, please. So here we can see the proliferation of the short-term rentals in Puerto Rico between 2014 and 2020. Was a sharp increase in the total number of short-term rentals available in the island, especially entire homes and apartments, right? Which is a dead giveaway that these are becoming more investment properties than just properties that were used as an extra source of income, which is usually the case for those that are offering shared rooms, which is the second line, the blue line over here. Next slide, please. So in Puerto Rico, about 83% of the total between 2014 and 2020, 83% of all the listings in short-term rentals are entire home and apartments. 15% are private rooms, and less than 1% are identified as hotel room or shared rooms. Next slide, please. And what is really alarming is that even though there's this myth that the short-term rentals are a very important source of income for folks that are trying to make ends meet, that are in a precarious situation. What we're finding is that through time, it's becoming increasingly more concentrated. So even though those short-term rental hosts, the ones that offer the properties, make up around 61% of the total number of hosts, they own less than a third of the total units that are being offered, and have earned less, around 20%, 21% of the total revenue that has been generated from short-term rentals in a 6-year period. On the other hand, those hosts that are more corporate in nature or more professionalized, that tend to have multiple listings, even though they're only 39% of the total number of hosts, they control 79% of the market. They earn 79% of the revenue, and manage over 2/3 of the total number of housing units that are available for short-term rental. So this is not really, an equal playing field at the moment. Next slide, please. So here you can see the location and proliferation of the short-term rental listings throughout Puerto Rico. So you have a large concentration in San Juan, there in the north, in coastal areas in general, right? Which is not surprising. In the island municipalities of Vieques and Culebra. So Culebra is that island that is totally red, and I should highlight that Culebra, it's the only municipality in Puerto Rico where there are actually more housing units than there are people living in the island. But there are more short-term rental listings offered than there are long-term rental units offered in the island. And what is particularly acute in that place is that there's no subsidized housing units in those places for the municipal workers, for teachers, or firefighters. They can't access subsidized housing because there are no subsidized acute. Seeing, of course, is the increase in activity from institutional and corporate investors. So this the simple graph just highlights the total number of land transactions that have been made by limited liability company, which is a common corporate entity used particularly by investors when they're engaged in land transactions, as it makes it hard to follow the paper trail. Also, as the name suggests, it makes it less liable for legal purposes. And you can see that the number of transactions went from a very, I think it was like 50 or so in 2010, or maybe a little more than that, 15, all the way to more than 3,000 by 2023. So this is like a proxy measure of how much speculation there is right now from many of these corporate investors in Puerto Rico at the moment. Next slide, please. So this, of course, to manage and do those, it needs a class of local mediators. Many of these are Puerto Rican companies that either provide services as realtors or real estate, accounting services. They ease the process for asset transactions. They provide legal assistance, and you have construction contracting that specializes in offering this in providing services for individual or corporate investors in the island. Next slide, please. And of course, as I mentioned, digital platforms is not only a short-term rental platforms, other platforms that are important for mediating many of these transactions. And that includes additional new digital platforms for short-term rental property management, and also for real estate analytics that gives them an advantage on how to speculate on different fronts. Next slide, please. So what are the mechanisms of land speculation? So disasters allow individual and institutional investors to maximize land rent through public subsidies, as well as tax exemptions, professional mediators, which I already mentioned, digital platforms, particularly short-term rental platforms, financial securitization as a way to secure their investments and their investment portfolio, and access to globalized markets. Next slide, please. But communities are not standing idle, right? Next slide, please. So you have many of them that are actually protesting, taking to the streets to demand change, right? They're very active, like these communities in Puerta de Tierra in Old San Juan. Next slide, please. You have folks that are engaged in squatting activities in different parts of the islands, like in Caguas, in certain parts of San Juan, in other municipalities. It's becoming a much more common theme, including squatting recently closed public schools to be reused as housing. Next slide. And also have collective tenure models that are used to avoid displacement, and also as a way to ensure long-term affordability. And this includes returning to the housing co-ops as an option, which is increasingly discussed more, and community land trusts, which I'm guessing you're going to have a presentation pretty soon on how community land trusts have been developed in Puerto Rico. Next slide. And the situation has gotten so bad that it has reached, for example, the popular culture in ways that it hasn't before. So this is from a video called, from a song called El Apagón, The Blackout, by Bad Bunny. And the video includes a 15-minute documentary on the housing situation and the displacement of communities in the island. And this image is taken straight from that video. So it's reaching popular areas that perhaps a lot of the government and folks involved in this process were not expecting. So, you know, it's not a passive setting right now. It's a very conflicting setting at the moment. And I think that would be all on my end. So I'll leave it up to questions, whatever questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raúl. I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I want to encourage people to start putting those questions in the chat. Before I get to discussions, and Jordan, stop sharing the screen, I'm just going to introduce Rivke. Dr. Rivke Jaffe is a professor of urban geography at the University of Amsterdam, and her work is really on connecting geography, anthropology, and cultural studies. Her work focuses primarily on intersections of urban and political spaces, and specifically on the spatialization and the materialization of power differences and inequality within cities like Jamaica. Her current research explores how urban inequalities are mediated, how they're reproduced, and how they are transforming in more than human ways by non-human entities, from digital technologies to security dogs. So we're gonna bring you on, but I just want to hop back to Raúl for a quick question that I think might be very useful. What is the simplest way that you can define speculation? And in a simple way as well, what sort of opportunities do disasters, whether they're natural disasters or socioeconomic disasters, what opportunities do those disasters create for real estate speculation?
So this is a very simplified answer to that question, but just for the sake of fostering the discussion afterward, I would say land speculation is the process by which value is assigned to land that goes beyond what you would call the real value, which is the real value being attached to the cost of materials and labor to make that land serviceable. So anything that is above that threshold, I would say speculative valuation, and it usually responds to location and amenities and other investments and services and jobs that stem from public investments or investments from third parties and not from the actual landowner.
Okay, great.
And in terms of how do storms managed to provide new grounding for that. So for storms, and they cause mass devastation as Hurricane Irma, especially Maria, did afterwards. They reduced housing values sharply. But of course, in those key attractive areas, they didn't have any less amenities. They still were close to the jobs. So that's when it provides the opportunities for investors that were not affected by these disasters to make massive gains at that specific juncture.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think in the Caribbean, we're used to natural disasters, hurricanes, storms, floods, volcanoes, earthquakes, right? But we are also used to kind of socioeconomic disasters, right? Crime being one of them. And Rivke, I want to know from your perspective, how is crime or crime prevention related to real estate, right? And I think the second part of that question is, how is security technology helping to support speculation?
Big questions, and I think they would be a research project on their own. So I'm not a housing expert, but have been studying crime and security measures in the Caribbean and Jamaica for some time now. I think there's different connections you can see. So I think what you're getting at most closely is how can we understand disaster capitalism in connection to urban real estate development. And I think for Jamaica, you could really understand the Tivoli incursion. So this very impactful and violent state security operation in 2010 as having been a sort of similar type of shock that disrupted all kinds of processes, even though other processes remained the same. And that also, in so doing, with oftentimes, of course, very good intentions, also bringing in social policies, also opened opportunities for real estate investment. So I think that's something you could compare perhaps to natural disasters. But I think there's other connections between crime and real estate. I think if you look at the construction industry in the Caribbean, but this goes for any I think any country in the world, you will see there's all kinds of links between corruption, organized crime, at the construction industry, but also that real estate investment is also a good site for money laundering. And then in Kingston, it's not so much self-built informal settlements, but more what you'd call captured land. So either so oftentimes existing housing that's been abandoned by the formal owners, but is being rented out in a sort of secondary market and being managed often by sort of criminal leaders, criminal organizations in a more informal way. So it's also this type of secondary rental market that is another type of connection. The security technology, I'm not sure, but what I think we see in the wake of the Tivoli incursion of this security operation is an attempt to have surveillance through increased databases, attempts to do this through biometric monitoring, which did receive a lot of pushback, but to bring everyone into the state system for security reasons. But again, the sort of monitoring databasing can also be connected to bringing people into financial systems, offering land tenure titles for squatted lands, but then using that tenure system to try and also bring people into a more financialized housing system. So it's a little fuzzier, I think, than some of the other connections, but that's also going on.
Yeah, and I mean, I think wrapping all of those things in the bucket of like disaster capitalism is interesting, right? That a disaster can take, numerous different forms, but it creates an opportunity where land can be speculated on, right? I can look at the land and say it's worth $10 based on where it is, the natural resources it may have, but maybe it's 15, maybe it's actually 20 because I'm speculating on it, because I've created these sort of conditions that I can extract more value out of that land, right? And Raúl, I wanted to go back to you about the digital technologies, right? Across Jamaica, Airbnbs have been here for, 2017, 2016, that's when it started. And there's a proliferation of Airbnb everywhere, right? Could you kind of talk about how I am able to download an app on my phone, right? How the ease and access of certain technologies is making speculation easier. And that in turn is kind of increasing the value, the expensiveness of land and housing.
Yeah, sure. So if you think, traditional ways to speculate on real estate, a lot of it has to do with the potential to achieve what folks that are involved in real estate call the highest and best value of your property, right? Meaning you can densify as much as you can to earn them as much as you can, right? But of course, that requires substantial investment, and at the same time requires it's sort of subject to the local market trends. What the digital platforms do, like Airbnb, is that they sort of fast forward that in ways that you don't really need to do the substantial investments to make the highest and best use, right? You can do some minor improvements to the property. You don't have to wait years to eventually capture the rents or the earnings from those investments. But using the digital platform, you can actually, you don't need to depend on the local pool of renters or folks that might be using that property. You can expand it to a global, transnational pool of possible users that are tourists that might come from anywhere in the world. And they do the transaction through the platform in real time. So you have cash in hand immediately, right? So it makes it very enticing. It makes that can earn a lot more from that investment, from that activity,
Yeah.
I should say.
And I mean, it's obviously clear across the Caribbean, all of our islands are immensely dependent on tourism, right? And that lots of these policies are marketed to kind of support the tourism industry. Airbnb, the MOU that was signed in Jamaica was like to advance the tourism industry by bringing tourists into the city as opposed to staying on the beaches in large hotels, right? So as the region, we're heavily dependent on tourism. What role does this industry play in sort of land speculation and the sort of general unaffordability of land and housing in the region? Anyone?
I can jump in as well, but for Jamaica, I think it might be a little different than Puerto Rico or some other contexts, because Kingston, the capital city, is so segregated, largely because of security issues as well from the mass tourism industry. But that doesn't mean you don't see similar mechanisms going on. But I think the type of visitor to Kingston is not your average tourist, but rather that you can connect this. This is something Kayon Christie, who is here in the audience as well, she is studying, but to look at diaspora and diaspora visitors, but also diaspora remigrants as also a significant population that's connected to these shifts and developing really an international type of rent regime as well. So I don't, you could classify this as tourist, but I think it's a different type of visitor with a different type of stake and a different type of budget, perhaps. That's also shaping this digitally mediated rent gap, gentrification as well.
So I would say that in the case of Puerto Rico, the government has been betting big on tourism for quite a few years now as a way to compensate for the loss of many of the manufacturing firms. They call urging what they call the visitor economy, which is the euphemism if there ever was one. But I think, and it's a highlight just to highlight this. Other cities, say in the U.S. and in Europe, so Airbnb is the subject of strict regulations and have a very adversarial relationship with governments. But in Puerto Rico, as in other places, they're seen kind of like a partner to co-develop the tourism strategy, right? Which then, you know, kind of leaves them without proper oversight into what's the activity is undergoing. And as I mentioned, the trend is towards concentration. You can find short-term rental listings in many of the quote unquote informal settlements in that, you know, and in other parts. Some of them cater to the diaspora visiting. So in Puerto Rico, there are more Puerto Ricans living abroad than there are living in the islands. But you also get a lot of U.S. visitors and European visitors and and folks from other places. And one thing that I didn't mention in the presentation is that almost half of the single listing hosts, the one that only have one listing, almost half of them never managed to earn a single dollar on Airbnb. So this means that you actually, to increase your opportunities to make money from this, you need to have many properties in different part of the island that respond to different seasonality. So they could only mean that the strategy towards success is consolidation and concentration. So, you know, it means that then you're really nurturing these new corporate figures that might increase their own political power that they might leverage when time comes to actually regulate this activity and see and address it in terms of how they affect housing units, not just competition towards hotels and hostels, but actually the actual housing needs of folks.
So I have a bunch of questions, but I want to go to audience Q&A. And so this first question is from Andre Yampier. I understand how Law 22 and Act 22 and Act 60 seems like it's only beneficial for the wealthy, but has it made any positive change for the local economy? And I just want to add in there that those are the particular laws in Puerto Rico, but there may be similar sort of investment policies across the region. We know in the Eastern Caribbean, there's lots of citizenship by investment sort of policies happening, and people are questioning them. I know in St. Lucia there was conversations around that. So are there any sort of positive impacts that those type of policies make on the ground?
Yeah, so Andre, your name sounds familiar, but Puerto Rico is an island of cousins, so I don't know. Maybe we met. But so that's a very fair question, right? It's an important one. Has it made any positive change for the local economy? I would say that there have been throughout the last 8 years studies published, four studies on the impacts of Act 22, now Act 60 in Puerto Rico. This is the one geared towards individual investors, and minus the latest one, the other ones showcase that none to very little to very negative, especially in terms of fiscal impacts, that the government is actually not failing to tax on because of those tax exemptions. But the last report showcased that for around 3,000, a little bit under active 3,000 exemption holders, they've created something like 8,000 jobs, which is 4 jobs per investor, which I guess you can actually create that same number of jobs through any other food truck or similar business probably more. So it's very limited. I mean, what it has an impact is on certain very niche, specialized professional services. Certain law firms, which are less and less and less, certain accounting firms, certain analytics firms, but it's not something that in aggregate would justify the actual fiscal cost, I think, and that's without mentioning the actual effects on neighborhoods and their effects on displacement and housing on affordability.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so there's another question in here from Jonas. Could you please expand on why the period following a natural disaster, and I want to expand it to be any type of disaster, often sees an increase in foreign or corporate investments. And Rivke, I want you to come in here as well. I think your research around downtown Kingston following the Tivoli incursion. Love you to both of you answer that question.
I mean, there are many reasons. I mean, a lot of that investment or attractiveness has to do with reconstruction works and how a lot of those contracts are handed out for construction works and usually not under competitive terms for different firms that first localize. So right then you have a common practice of trying to make the most out of a crisis, right? That stems from a natural disaster. And let me mention, just to highlight, everything is key, is related to the key decisions being made immediately after the disaster. How things are going to be rebuilt, who has access to reconstruction funding, who is eligible, who's going to be criminalized as part of this process. That's going to determine where are the actual sites of opportunities. In terms of land, what it does is, that's, as I mentioned, it cheapens land almost immediately as part of the reconstruction. But of course, where governments decide to rebuild or prioritize reconstruction also has an effect of attracting investments immediately afterwards. So those are some of the key issues. Now, how this materializes is going to depend on each one of these contexts, right? In some places like in Florida, in the US, I mean, it's not really Airbnb who's making a killing, but there's a lot of corporate landlords that stock up on different properties for long-term rentals and then jack up prices and increase evictions in those places. So that's very different from what I'm describing in Puerto Rico, where it's actually investors that use short-term rentals as their vehicle for land extraction. But I'll leave it to Rivke to expand.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think you'd really have to follow the money more closely to really see who's benefiting the most. But I think you saw in the wake of the Tivoli incursion, one thing that went along with these policing operations was regularization attempts. So this was for state utilities, but they're now also sort of public-private companies. So the electricity company, JPS, and also water, though I think the focus was on electricity. But I would think it's mainly in the people who have been holding on to their properties and have been, especially in areas that are close to either corporate, sort of that part of downtown Kingston, or in places that are close to the university, for instance, close to uptown, sort of middle class areas. So I think it's in housing as sort of office holding entities, but also individuals as well as utilities that I see it most closely. And those are mostly locally owned, though JPS is also partially foreign owned.
Okay. So just to clarify, what Rivke was researching around the Tivoli incursion, lots of these sort of security measures, not just in Kingston, but across Jamaica, include land regularization, right? Which means that you are giving community members who had informal sort of ownership of a land, actual and it's Island City Lab's assumption that if you give someone a deed, right, and there's broader land speculation happening around that community, that it then becomes a bit easier to potentially displace those communities. All of that becomes no possible because everyone has a deed. And so you can legally go through the process of displacing and breaking up a community. That's our perception. I don't want to put words into your mouth, Rivke, but that's kind of what we're seeing.
No, I think it's just a quick, it hasn't been rolled out on a large scale, but I think there's an attempt to couple land titling with as part of security operations under emergency powers. So it's a special operation that I think we should be very skeptical of, because it sounds like a great thing. Who wouldn't want their sort of informally held land formally titled? But I think if it leads to displacement and if it is targeted precisely at those areas where the rent gap is largest because they're close to, in Montego Bay, close to tourist areas, or in Kingston, Spanish Town, close to sort of corporate areas, I'd be very skeptical of this move to title precisely those areas together with police operations.
And so there's a question in here from Jasmine Harris. Do you foresee the market for Airbnb crashing at some point? The impact it has had on housing in general has, in my opinion, created more negative implications for locals in the Caribbean. Well, I'm assuming the Caribbean than anything else. So I guess we're asking you both to do a little, conjuring of what you think is going to be happening in the market next.
So currently, at least in Puerto Rico, I will speak to Puerto Rico right now. The Airbnb market is sort of plateaued for a while. There are the number of units hasn't really increased for quite a while. While it's being a more, increasing trend toward more concentration. So you see more and more certain hosts having more and more properties, but the total number of properties available for rent have been stalled for over a year now. So what that tells me that there's a level of cannibalism to this, right? That I think it's reached a tipping point. But still, the issue with when folks started discussing this issue a few years ago, they were thinking that it might reach the entire island of Puerto Rico. But it's really happening is just it keeps being concentrated in the higher opportunity areas, those places that are actually close to jobs, that are close to services, that are close to amenities. Those are mostly coastal towns. And what it's made is that there's a unrecognizable, I would say, community fabric in those places. It's changed substantially. And it's also becoming increasingly segregated. But I think it's definitely reached a tipping point for some time now.
And I just want to make sure it's clear that everyone understands. One of the findings that you mentioned in the presentation, and I think it's one of those kind of generic ideas of Airbnb, that it's a mom and a pop, their child has left and they have an extra room, they have an extra bedroom, or a garage that they've turned into an apartment, and that they are using that for Airbnb to pay off the remainder of the mortgage. And that's a cool opportunity, right? But what Raúl has found, at least in Puerto Rico, is that that's not necessarily the case anymore, right? And that we're moving from sort of mom and pop or a young couple who is renting out half of their home to pay off their mortgage. That is changing, and that you're seeing more sort of corporate ownership of these homes, right? And I just want to make sure it's clear, Raúl, when that happens and there's more sort of corporate ownership of Airbnbs, aka homes, right? What does that do for the price for, young people like myself who are trying to move out of my parents? So what happens then?
It's increasingly hard for young workers to find housing right now. I mean, I didn't get all these figures, but over half of renters in Puerto Rico spend over a third of their income. Most renters are young workers. And even those that manage to land a mortgage, around more than 40% of those mortgage holders spend over a third of their income in housing costs. So they're still in a precarious situation, right? So housing is the single largest expense for any household or any individual. So when you're spending the most of that money in that area, you have very little disposable income. You need to have finding multiple jobs, of going between jobs to make ends meet. And it's impossible to achieve, say, financial stability or other important measures of quote unquote success to actually achieve social mobility. So right now, I think it's being a key issue concerning the large exodus of Puerto Ricans in the islands. I've been losing population for almost 20 years now. And it's become increasingly more acute in recent years, to the point that Puerto Rico is one of the fastest aging places in the world because of the migration of young workers, faster than even Japan and South Korea, just to give you an idea. Which leads me to one of the questions that I'm seeing here, Doreen, if I can answer quickly, from my dear friend Lynn, who's doing great work in Puerto Rico and Barbua. Puerto Rico is unique in some way or fashion in terms of how hurricanes or disaster provide fertile ground for vulture capitalists and disaster capitalists. And I would say no. I mean, part of the idea is to I would say definitely not unique. I mean, each place is going to have their own unique mechanisms by which this happens, of course, which is rooted in their own politics, their own institution, its own cultural settings, its own social dynamics. But in overall, I think it is kind of like a warning shot for our neighbors here everywhere that might very likely experiencing this already for quite a while, and those that haven't, just to get a clear sense of what's coming, because it's something that it's increasingly common throughout cities in the world.
Thank you so much. I think it's the perfect way to end it, right? And I want to acknowledge that we didn't get to every question. I know there are other questions from Lina, from Rachel, a couple other folks. But I want to thank our speakers today, Professor Raúl Santiago-Bartolomei and Rivke Jaffe, for participating in this conversation, and everyone who showed up for the event and asked all of these really important questions. All of the events, all of our forums are recorded and will be posted to the Island City Lab YouTube page. And lastly, this was just the first of our 3 webinars in the Capture Land series. So please look out for marketing coming up in the next few weeks for other conversations that I think really build on this conversation that we had today. The next one is going to be September 17th, Our Land. It's going to be self-built communities securing a future. Again, we're going back to Puerto Rico, talking to the Caño Peño Community Land Trust, kind of about approaches to managing and maintaining affordability. And then the last one is going to be October 15, Legacy Land, Disaster Capitalism and Land Grabs. And that's going to be going to Barbuda. I'm going to be talking to the Barbuda land actors. I want to thank everyone for joining on, and hopefully this conversation was super edifying and hopefully answers some questions that I think lots of us have around the real estate market. Thank you again, Raúl and Rivke, and hopefully we'll see you guys in the next upcoming conversations next month.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.